Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Caringo Tech Tuesday webinar. This session's topic is Intelligent Data Management for Access, Archive, and Content. I'm John Bell, Senior Consultant at Caringo. Today, our subject matter expert is Eric Day, Director of Product at Caringo. Eric will be available to answer your questions throughout the webinar and at the end of today's presentation. Make sure you stay with us until the end, as Eric always has some good parting words of advice. In addition, we have some resources available for you via the Attachments and Links window on your view screen. If you have any questions after the webinar, you can always reach us by email at info@caringo.com. And let's take a moment to introduce ourselves, and I'll go ahead and kick it off. Again, I'm John Bell. I'm a Senior Consultant at Caringo. I've been with Caringo for over 9 years. And in the course of that time, I've had the opportunity to wear multiple hats, but mainly I work as a consultant for our customers in professional services and support. And this has given me the chance to touch a great many of the implementations of Caringo Swarm that exist in the field. Eric, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, John. I'm Eric Day, Director of Product at Caringo. I've been here a little over 14 years and been involved with a lot of different aspects of our product and product line. And I look forward to sharing what we've got for you today in the new 12.0 release of Swarm.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Eric. Okay, so before we dive in, let's go over a little bit of history about Caringo for those of you who may be new to us. Caringo was founded in 2005 to change the economics of storage by designing software from the ground up to solve issues associated with relentless data growth. Caringo's flagship product, Swarm, decouples data from applications and hardware, providing a foundation for continued data access and analysis that constantly evolves while guaranteeing data integrity. Today, Caringo software-defined solutions are used to preserve and provide access to rapidly scaling data sets across many industries by organizations such as NEP, BT Television, Disney Streaming Services, Real Salt Lake, Science and Technology Facilities Council, Argonne National Labs, Texas Tech University, the Department of Defense, the National Institute of Health, and hundreds more worldwide. So let me just quickly go through the agenda for today's webinar before I hand it over to Eric. Today we're going to go over the following topics of discussion. We will review the current market trends for distributed workflow requirements. We will focus on capabilities for ease of management and resource optimization in object storage solutions. Associated with that, we'll also dive into simplifying distributed collaboration and delivery for your teams. We'll demonstrate how it's easier to store, organize, find, and share files using Swarm storage. We'll review streamlined end-user administration capabilities, go over how we optimize for SLAs, cost and offsite storage requirements, then discuss how we maximize utilization of hardware, and we'll also go over some additional product capabilities, including Kringle FileFly and Swarm FS. And then finally, we'll go through our question and answer session and our wrap up. And with that said, Eric, I'm going to go ahead and hand over the keys to you and let you drive.
Okay, thank you, John. Okay, so the trend in the market, this is not new, and you can hear this from plenty of our other webinars and written content online. That you've got this increasing amount of data that's being produced, and increasingly people want access to more and more and more of it from a variety of different applications and different sources. And so really the challenge becomes one of how do you find and get to all the data that's being produced, and how do you deal with it as file sizes and data sets are constantly increasing. You know, file size increasing is one thing, but just the sheer number of files is an equally daunting thing. people, as I said, want various ways to use data that's being produced. That's through different applications that exist today, as well as what will exist next year and in 5 years from now, and want to operate on that same data that you're producing today. And then you have this, as you're producing more and more data, you have this growing need to you've got to protect it long term, and so you need a system that is going to take over a lot of that long term protection for you. And that's kind of the highlights of the distributed workflow there, of producing more data and needing to find a way to find the data that you want, needle in the haystack, and then access it.
And Eric, if you don't mind me adding real quick, if you go back to that slide,
sure.
The one aspect of this is, in particular, when it comes to various points of creation and consumption, what we've observed, and Eric, I'm sure you'll back me on this, is that a lot of our customers are having to struggle with the requirements around the points of creation and consumption when it comes to, not just distributed workflow, but remote workers. And they're finding things out as they try to implement this, such as, VPN does not scale well for them. It's hard to get that rolled out to their remote workers, things of that nature. And what we've tried to do in Caringo Swarm is facilitate this ease of providing that point of creation and consumption without a lot of overhead that's involved with things such as, having to VPN into the corporate site or anything like that. And we're trying to make this as much of a web-enabled workflow as possible.
Yeah, actually, John, thanks. That actually is a really it's something of a related thought to this whole deck, is that we've talked. I've had other presentations where we talked about the effects of the pandemic on what it's done with people and their workflows, and one of the things that very obvious is that suddenly everyone became remote workers in a lot of different industries, or at least for a lot of different jobs. But they didn't bring their data with them because, first of all, they couldn't. I mean, you can't bring petabytes worth of data home with you.
Right.
You also can't access multiple petabytes of data. I actually read petabytes of data remotely, but you can access petabyte-sized and larger data sets remotely, as long as you can find the stuff that you're looking for. So you're not trying to do some brute force thing of trying to synchronize the shared folders from your servers at work on everybody's home laptop or desktop. That's a non-starter. You don't have network bandwidth for that. You don't have time to wait for that. But this desire of, I've got to keep working with the data. We have a lot of folks in media and entertainment that have huge pools of historical content that were produced, games that were played and so on in the past, years and decades, that they're now repurposing and reusing. Well, the way they're doing that is they're finding that data in their, over their VPN remotely. They're finding the data where it lives and bringing selective parts of it back so that they can work with it. And so that's been a real variation on that multiple points of consumption and creation in just the last 11 months or so, 10, 11 months.
Thanks, Eric.
And so let me talk to you specifically about Swarm 12. I encourage you to look at the other webinars and written content that we have online about all of the features that we have in our Swarm product line. But today I'm going to focus on what we've rolled out with the new version 12 release of it. And it is, as has always been our focus, we continue to look to optimize our system to work with limited administrative staff to manage and be the stewards of the hardware and the software that is your data storage. People have, they've got, as we've discussed, they've got distributed data workflows that were already that are already existing prior to the pandemic, but that's really forced a lot of faster movement with the focus on how do we further distribute or allow distributed access to the system. So let me touch then on some of the main points in this release. New things that we've got is we have focused on ease of management. That is one of the ways is that we've gone through we've had some customers drive some use cases that are really growing with the respect to distributed collaboration and delivery of content throughout multiple sites around the world. We have looked to simplify the end user way that people store files, organize, and find files within our system, and I'll show off the UI changes for that. We've also focused on streamlining administration by adding to our already rich identity management feature set by adding the single sign-on capability with SAML 2.0 compatible services or components that already exist within your infrastructure. Certainly as you now talk about distributing out access and sharing more remotely than just workers sitting in an office, the advent of single sign-on really comes into play there, where you might have mobile devices as well as mobile laptops that are moving about. In this release, we also looked at optimizing resources within the system, and so we have our larger customers tend to deploy very, very dense hardware, meaning hardware that could it has as many disk drives within it and a lot of CPU and RAM and network capability within a single server chassis. Anytime you do that now, you have to be very efficient about how well you utilize that hardware so that you don't turn it into a bottleneck. And so we've gone through and focused on that pretty heavily in this release, as well as we focused on the use case of very high transaction loads. That complements flash storage very well. For example, when you're dealing with thousands and thousands of transactions per second through the system. And then we have worked to simplify the administrative workflow within this release. That's something that our admins who have to deal with our system on a daily basis will really appreciate. So let me get into the first point here, which was how we've helped with the distributed collaboration and content delivery in the system. The feature that I'm referring to is something that we have called Remote Synchronous Write. And that is a complement to the other data protection capabilities that are already in our system. Specifically, we have the capability of doing synchronous data protection across multiple disk drives, multiple chassis within a local cluster. We have the capability to do the same thing for a geo-dispersed or stretched cluster, so that you can have within the same cluster have things be geo-dispersed and know that they are geo-dispersed in a synchronous manner. We then have the ability to do asynchronous replication between different sites when those sites start to have more latency or more bandwidth restrictions between them. And this is now a complement on that last item, where you can have content that is selectively will be guaranteed to have a synchronous replication across distant sites in cases where applications need to know that something exists in one or more locations at the time that that write is done and successful. And there's really two cases that drive that. One is applications that need to be assured that their data is absolutely protected in more than one site before they move on. So sort of the transaction logic of that would be that I know I need to have dispersed replication. Otherwise, there's additional transaction healing steps I need to take. But if I know that it's dispersed and protected, then I can move on and complete the transaction. The other case that comes into play. Sorry, John, you have a question on that?
No, I was just going to say another area where this comes into play is for our media and entertainment customers, where they're particularly focused on content delivery and publication, and making sure that things are local to certain geographic regions as soon as they are written into the overall architecture. But I believe you were going to touch on that.
Yep. So that is the second most common case right there. So the first case is I want to know that it's protected, but the other case, so that's a transaction level thing. But the other thing that people want to know is, from a transaction level, I am going to publish the existence of something as soon as I complete this transaction, and I'm going to publish that globally. And usually that means publishing it from the point of view of, think of a video distribution where you could have people accessing it from different places around the world. Well, as soon as you publish the existence of something and say, okay, this is where it lives now, you could immediately have other applications that are disconnected from the ingest or the writer immediately try to pull those from their local site. So you could have somebody on the west coast of the US and somebody in the UK that both see that this thing is available, and they go to their local cluster and say, I'd like to read it right now and deliver it out to my end users. Well, you need to know from a transactional point of view that when you publish it, that really does exist in those multiple locations. So it's kind of a nuance on protection that you don't really need it for protection purposes. You really need it to know that I don't have to now invent some other kind of synchronization technology to tell these disconnected applications that, okay, it's now, yes, I published it, but you've got to wait a little while before you can access it. I can know that I can now move on and let them pull it when they want to pull it. So two real key customer cases that we were solving with the same feature there. Again, one is protection, and one is just simplifying application transaction logic, publishing logic. This feature runs automatically, meaning that it is it's always there. You actually are given the ability to configure it in our system at a domain or at a per bucket level. So you can designate certain buckets as being buckets that I would like this content that goes into here that is added or that is changed to be synchronously updated across multiple geographies. And you can then be selective with that and say that only stuff that absolutely requires that requirement or needs that kind of assurance is subject to that synchronous policy, and content that's put in other buckets or other domains within the system can be allowed to use the asynchronous capabilities of synchronization. And that is, our asynchronous feeds, replication feeds, are very efficient. They will make use of the bandwidth that you give them, and given bandwidth that matches your ingest, in a very timely way, they can publish stuff to other sites. So it's not like you're really giving up a lot by doing it, but in the cases where you absolutely need those assurances, you can selectively turn that on. And so I think I've hit the topics here for what it's designed for. John, do you have any anything to add on that?
Well, I would just add, Eric, that a lot of the work that our team has put into this feature, naturally, what we're trying to do is we're trying to enable ease of publication and collaboration in a world that is basically heterogeneous when it comes to wide area network performance and capabilities. And that's one of the major problems people ran into when they were trying to figure out, well, how can I support this? I have no control over this thing called the internet like I would with my in-house private network or even my local area network. How do I guarantee that these things will happen the way I want them to on something that I don't have full control over? And these are the type of mechanisms that allow you to achieve that goal.
It is, and with our, as we've previously discussed with our replication feeds, those are perfectly able to use the internet at large to distribute things. We have transport level security, so SSL, TLS encryption for those feeds, and so they can actually go across the long haul and public networks and deal with the nuances of varying latencies and even periods of disconnectedness. Okay, so another part of this release was then a focus on the end user portion of the system. So our users are increasingly, especially when you get into remote workers, they will be using sets of applications, but there's also times they need to be able to go in and look through content that's in the system, and this is where our content portal is an equally valuable part of the overall storage system. Is that it is a web interface controlled by the same authentication and permissioning that applications or even end user applications or server type applications would use. That end users can log into the system and look for content. They can create searches on content. They can upload. We talked about last year how we did a lot of work around our very efficient ingest and uploading through the browser. And then this level adds an extra level of familiarity. As we know from object storage, that there really are a very few number of components to the namespace in object storage. Some system would call it an endpoint. In our system, we call it a domain. You would then have buckets in that domain or that endpoint. And then within the bucket, you have objects. And so there is no directory level of the hierarchy, but people tend to simulate directories by using slashes in the names of objects. In fact, that's a very natural way that whenever you have file protocols that use object storage as the back end, they make use of those slashes and names to delineate what they know as folders or subdirectories. And so when you have, say, an ingest application that's using NFS to write data into our object store, we wanted to let users be able to browse that in the same way that they do when they're looking at it as through their file system protocol. Now, we all know that as you have relentless data growth, and as you get billions and billions and billions of objects within the system, that the whole single hierarchy of a file structure, directories and subdirectories and more subdirectories, and eventually arriving at a file name, we realize that that this content defies the ability to classify it under a single organizational hierarchy. And this is where that folder structure completely falls down when you talk about millions and billions of files, and that you really need a way to do metadata searching. You need to really be able to search on files that are not in a way that is not tied to the name that they were given. And this UI, helps you have the best of both. That, we've got other webinars where we talk about how the UI enables you to do the real kind of searching that you want to do, but then we also show you this familiar file directory structure so that it provides maximum familiarity with the file world, especially for the file protocols that are interfacing with it. And so end users have less retraining needed to be able to immediately pick up and start using this. Anything you want to add to that, John?
Well, I would just add that it's pretty difficult to unwind decades of people being used to POSIX and file systems. And that's the capability that we're bringing to the table here is, if your applications or your consumers of the data are used to browsing and managing it in a more traditional fashion, this is what allows them to continue working in that way. But underneath the covers, you have the new way of doing things too, with a list and query and CAN searches with collections and other sophisticated means that object storage brings to the table that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do with traditional file system implementations. So it's the best of all worlds.
That's right. Okay, and it makes me think of something that really the file system in that sort of that folder or subdirectory view of data is really kind of like the first generation of data use. Of you put something into the system, and the first way that you start using it is perhaps with the file structure that it had when where it came from, or that you originally put it in. But then we talk about you're going to have applications in next year or 2 years or 5 years from now that want to use that data, that same data, but use other data as well. And so that first generation of organizational structure, a name structure, is not going to mean anything to it. In fact, the name of the object itself really becomes kind of meaningless as you get to second generation and third generation uses of that data. Really, the name just becomes an identifier, and what's really important then is how do I search and find the identifiers, the object names that I'm looking for in the system.
Right, and it helps prevent the siloing of that data too. You have a single storage solution that's managing all these different ways of access, as opposed to having to segment things out just because one application has to do it one way, but this application has to do it the other way. It completely prevents data silos, brings it all under a single umbrella of management, but at the same time, it's extremely flexible in the way that your users can interact with the data.
Yep. So let's move along to how we have streamlined the some administration capabilities in this release. As I mentioned in the intro, we already have a very broad and flexible support for different identity management systems. If you've seen our other presentations, you'll realize that we can actually tie to multiple identity management systems at the same time within our system. And so with this release, you can still do that, and we've added SAML 2.0 as an additional identity management source that can be used simultaneously, singularly or simultaneously with all the existing ones. SAML 2.0 is a standard, and as far as standards go, everyone's got their own, could have their own sort of flavor of implementation for it. So, I would say that as long as if you've got a single sign-on SAML 2.0 infrastructure, chances are we're going to drop into it just fine. We have specifically tested with these common public services, so Okta, the Google G Suite, and OneLogin. That's not to say that yours won't work. It almost certainly will. It's got to be SAML 2.0. And John, do you have anything to add on that?
Not much to add. I would note that in particular, Our ability to integrate with identity management using just standard Linux PAM is extremely powerful. We've leveraged that in multiple implementations, and it works well in the field. Our Active Directory and LDAP implementations as well are seasoned over multiple major releases and are quite capable. But Eric is absolutely correct. The cherry on top with this release is the introduction of support for SAML 2.0 single sign-on and our ability to interact with a very large number, I would anticipate, of identity providers that are available to you.
That's right. So a typical setup for us would be that your you usually start talking about multiple identity providers when you get into some of our MSP style customers who have several customers of their own that they're providing services to, and that their local administrators will be from one identity management system. You know, those are the storage administrators that are running the system, but then each of their different customers will have a different, you know, section of the AD or LDAP tree, or perhaps an identity management system that is on the customer site. And that's where single sign-on can be very valuable. There is that lets them then extend that even further, especially when you're talking about end users who will be accessing the web, you know, this web UI from a variety of sources. That the desire to sort of unify into these SSO services becomes greater.
Yeah, and it allows you to surface your storage in a way, Eric, that becomes cross-organizational. You know, you may be working with partners that are in completely different companies, but they're trusted partners, and you want to be able to, you know, provide within your storage solution that you have in-house, you know, provide access to them, and you don't want to have to go through, you know, all the planning and procedure that goes into things like I mentioned earlier, like, oh my God, you know, setting up separate client VPN for specific trusted people or anything like that. It's much easier to do this with an identity provider arrangement, and then just being able to say from a policy-based perspective who's allowed to see what within the storage.
That's right. That's right. It's much easier to express the trust relationship when we can do it through something like SAML.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and let's now move along to some other great stuff in this release. We have previously rolled out the capability of our S3 backup feeds, and this is to use an S3 target as a backup and disaster recovery solution for sites that for customers that did not have secondary sites and wished to use public cloud for it, or customers that wished to have additional insurance. We've got people who want 3 different places for backup. I know our partner Wasabi is very big about talking about, you know, 3 different types of storage for data assurance and protection. What we have done is with this release, we have gone farther and we have added direct support for S3 Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive, and meaning that you can still have you can still back up to S3, more of the hot online style storage, but for cases where you absolutely want to use it as pure DR and you don't really anticipate any sort of day-to-day restorations from it, then Glacier becomes an attractive spot for you to back up your data to. Glacier Deep Archive is just similar kind of thing with you know, potentially much longer and greater access times for it. To give you an idea on these, it's really Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive are really not about data protection. They protect your data just fine. it really comes to how long it takes you to get data back. In the case of Glacier Deep Archive, you know, without paying a huge premium on it, you could be looking at 48 hours for data to become available once you've issued a restoration request for it. And so this is really reserved for cases where you truly want DR. You know, in the case of a disaster where you lost your entire primary site and you're going to need to restore it, you know, you've got more tasks to do than just triggering the restore. You need a place for it to come home to. So, you know, talking about, you know, an hour or 12 hours for content availability is not a big deal in those time frames. We also, with the Glacier API, pick up some really interesting other capabilities. Like I encourage you to read up about our integration with the Fujifilm Object Archive. That is a tape archive that implements the Glacier API, and so it doesn't necessarily need to be a public cloud that you're going to when you're using this API. You can go to on-prem tape systems as well.
And Eric, I would just add, you know, to put a little more color to this, these are the type of features that we bring to the table with our new release. Really, they're there to facilitate, you know, what traditionally would be known as a cold site approach to disaster recovery. You know, you're basically are completely down. Your data is in Glacier or Glacier Deep Archive. You need to pull it back to something that you've recreated from scratch, and that may take some time. So right. when you're evaluating, you know, these features, you know, whether it's building your own in-house DR cluster with Swarm, as opposed to sourcing the DR out to the cloud, some of the things you're going to have to bear in mind while you're putting together your solution for the requirements you have in front of you. You're going to have to take a look at your organization's business continuity plans and disaster recovery plans. And specifically, you're going to want to focus on recovery time and recovery point objectives. Those are going to be very important when it comes to planning out, you know, which aspects of the solution you're going to leverage the most, and what expectations should be set with the organization on how quickly things can be recovered back to the way they were before the incident occurred. And that would be my only guidance there.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, you would be right to ask the question of how does this, you know, if you look on our site, you'll notice that we've got a partnership with Sabi. And how does this work, you know, in looking at that, how does this play with that? And I would say that it's very hard to beat the economics and the availability, you know, just
right.
Of the Wasabi solution. That you have to, you know, in cases where you know that if I need to get at this data, it is okay. It is okay that it could take me 12 hours or more to have this data come online, like you would with Glacier Deep Archive. And that it is okay for me to pay the extra cost premium to actually read that data back, because Glacier has if you look at the pricing structure for it, is really priced around cases of you not sort of ad hoc deciding that you just want to read something because you want it in a different location, or you accidentally deleted it and you just want to bring it back. If you're thinking about those kinds of cases where I might need rapid access to it, or I'm going to routinely ask for things to be read back, then that's where you probably are better suited by more of a hot online solution, and where Wasabi is a very competitive offering. If you can plan for it and know that I'm going to be putting data out there that most likely won't be read, hoping that I don't have a disaster, then that's where, at some point you start getting into when one becomes more cost effective than the other. And that's stuff that we're happy to talk with you all about when trying to decide what's best here. And that's why we added this too, to just basically expand the possibility of what we can, where we can write to for this backup and DR data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a risk assessment exercise that goes with that, and as Eric says, you certainly don't want to paint yourself into a situation where you've overspent.
Right.
If a certain solution will fit the bill, then don't buy any more than what you need. But at the same time, you don't want to underspend. If the data needs to be hot, you need to be able to cut over quickly. You may want to leverage a different aspect of how Swarm manages that particular requirement. And naturally, we're extremely flexible, depending on the requirements that you bring to the table.
Yep. So let me now get to the last set of stuff in this release. Is I mentioned that we did a lot of optimization around dense hardware, but also cases where you've got very high transaction workloads, thousands of transactions per second. So we have optimized around that case of, I say optimize, we have optimized the case of very high transaction loads. That is not at the detriment of anything else. That is just a real focus, this release, on making that even more efficient. And that can be the case of where you're going against traditional spinning disks, or where you're actually using flash in the system, whether your transactions are localized to very high speed solid state devices, or whether they're spread across thousands of drives in the system. Both of those can be very high transaction load use cases. We've also done a lot of work on ensuring that we're, maximizing the use of dense chassis where you have a lot of CPU cores and a lot of disk drives, even very large drives. Those tend to go hand in hand, where you have not only a large count of drives, but that count of drives will be made up of the larger the larger drives that are on the market these days. So you could have 14 terabytes in just a single drive. And so, just inherently you have a lot of work to do right there to ensure that you've got very good throughput and access, multi-threaded access to those large storage devices.
And Eric, if you don't mind me interjecting real quick, there's a trap that people fall into when they take a look at these type of features when a vendor brings them to the table. And that trap is that people tend to focus on performance solely. And as Eric and I can tell you, the elephant in the room that everybody can't forget about is speed of recovery in these dense solutions when there's a very large unit of failure. We're talking about highly dense chassis that have very large hard drives in them. When we say that we have optimized for large hard drives and for dense hardware, not only have we optimized for superb performance, we've optimized for situations where a unit of failure has occurred in the cluster, and it needs to be, and that the data associated with that unit needs to be recovered within the remainder of the cluster quickly.
Yeah, so as you said, the elephant in the room, a fact that you can't get around is if you had all your eggs in one basket, you had one extremely huge, large server chassis, and it had all the disk drives in it for all the storage that you needed. Well, if you lose that, you've lost everything. If you say, okay, well, I'll get two of them. So I'll just do everything with two server chassis. Well, if you lose one, again, you've got that entire chassis worth that now needs to be recovered. How do you do it? Where do you do it? And so there's always this balancing act between I want to make the systems as dense and efficient as possible, but I also need to make it such that my unit of failure is manageable, because the system is going to automate the recovery for you, but it does need some place to do it, and you can't be taking out 100% or 50% of all of your storage capacity and expect that you've still got enough reserve to reprotect your data.
And I would add that it's the aspects of improved client performance. Those same characteristics can be used for the recovery scenarios as well. Recall this is a completely RESTful API. The swarm nodes are communicating with each other, basically, with HTTP protocol. So if you're optimizing for that HTTP protocol traffic for clients, then by the same token, you're optimizing for intra-cluster care and feeding of the data that resides within it.
Yeah, that's right. Through other areas of our product line, we have also got features for you here. FileFly gets an update to allow for direct migration from Isilon systems, and it's got a completely refreshed and improved user interface for it. We've renamed what we previously called Swarm NFS to call it Swarm FS, with an acknowledgement that it actually enables the use cases where you're using other file system protocols to interface it with our object storage system. So not only NFS, but you can do SMB and you could do FTP or SFTP through that same piece of technology. I mentioned that we had some improvements for administration. With this update, it decouples the sort of the upgrade matrix between our metadata searching or metadata caching for ad hoc searching engine in Elasticsearch from SwarmFS. So SwarmFS now is interfacing solely with our content gateway, and so now in the upgrade matrix, you've decoupled the handling of Elasticsearch from the upgrade path of SwarmFS, or to say it another way, SwarmFS does not need to worry about the nuances of our continual evolution of Elasticsearch any longer, and because it's only talking to the gateway, our content gateway. So for administrators, that's going to be it's hard to talk about some of that from just a pure features point of view, but I know we've got a lot of our existing admins who are going to be very happy about getting to remove an item from that upgrade matrix.
Yeah, that's definitely a huge win for our SwarmFS users that are currently out in the field. Their upgrade path will become much simpler.
Mm-hmm. And John, with that, I'm going to give it back to you. That's about all, unless you've thought of any questions along the way.
I don't think we have any audience questions in the queue, Eric. Everything looks clear, so I'll go ahead and take this off your hands. Thank you very much, Eric. I appreciate that. This is a great overview of the next release.
You're welcome, and thank you for all the folks listening to it live or listening to it on a recording.
Yes, thanks for joining us today. So be sure, to keep up with Caringo, to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, or Facebook. If you do have any additional questions or would like to schedule a custom demonstration, please email us at info@caringo.com. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to invite you all to join us on December 15th. And that will be our next Tuesday webinar. And I'll be hosting Jamshid Afshar. He is our senior software engineer here at Caringo. And our topic will be how Elasticsearch is used with object storage. So that said, thanks again, everyone. And we hope to see you next month.